This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we mark the third anniversary of the triple meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan, we return to our exclusive extended interview in Tokyo in the offices of Naoto Kan, Japan's prime minister at the time of the catastrophe. Mr. Kan, can you explain your decision to order the TEPCO workers to remain at the plant when TEPCO wanted them removed?
Well, the first thing which happened at 3 a.m. on March the 15th, the Minister for the Economy came to my office, came to me, and he said that the TEPCO headquarters had requested to him for the workers from the Daiichi site to be withdrawn from their positions. However, then considering what could happen on the site if all of TEPCO's technicians from on-site were withdrawn, considering the fact that there were 6 reactors and 4 spent fuel pools at the Daiichi site itself, this would mean the potential of losing control completely of this whole site. Even if the self-defense forces, for example, were sent into the location, sent into the site, of course, they are not trained to deal with nuclear operations. So with no TEPCO staff, no TEPCO technicians on site, this would in effect mean actually abandoning all of these 6 reactors and 7 pools on the Daiichi site, which would mean in turn that the worst-case scenario could actually become reality. And so despite the, of course, huge risk that was there, I decided that it was very important to keep the technicians and the TEPCO workers on site for as long as possible to try and deal with the situation. So I called in the president of TEPCO to tell him this, and also I physically went myself to the headquarters of TEPCO at 4 a.m. to directly tell this to the officials of the company. At the same time, I also decided it was important to make sure that decision-making and information could be done properly between TEPCO and the government to set up a joint control center. I set this up within the TEPCO headquarters, but brought in Minister Kaida and also my advisor, Mr. Hosono, in place to be permanently within this control center to work with TEPCO and the government together to try and deal with the situation.
Who was responsible for this catastrophe, for the meltdown at the reactors?
First of all, I believe that the fact that all of the electricity was lost through this earthquake and tsunami, but no preparation or no consideration of such accidents or such things happening, and no preparations being made for this under the assumption that no accidents could happen. And the technical side of things from this, including both the facilities and also the staffing situation, and the lack of ensuring the full safety of the plant, but still continuing to increase nuclear power plants and the situation. The responsibility for this lies on the state of Japan and on the government, including me. There is also responsible on TEPCO as the operator, in fact, of the site for not predicting, not expecting, not planning for such an accident to happen. But politically, of course, the responsibility lies on me, the government at the time, and also the previous government and TEPCO in charge of the plant.
There have been questions about another of the owners of the nuclear reactors having higher levee walls to protect the reactors. Here you have TEPCO very close to those that are regulating them. Who, in fact, was in charge?
So the location of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is originally actually on a high level, originally 35 meters above water. But what happened when the nuclear power plant was constructed is that this soil was actually cut down and built lower. So the plant was actually, and the 6 reactors were actually in the end built at a height of 10 meters above sea level. And so this fact, the fact that although it had originally been 35 meters, but it was changed to be built at 10 meters, if this had not happened, if it had stayed at the original 35 or even 20 meters, then even in the case of a large tsunami, this may have been high enough to prevent this kind of damage. And so the problem here is the fact that no kind of measures had been put in place expecting or saying that no such accident, no such disaster could ever happen. And in regards to the second part of your question, in regards to regulations, the safety standards for construction and operations of the nuclear power plants was in large set by the Ministry of Economy and within the government. However, when these kind of standards are being decided, there are, of course, many different experts, nuclear experts and so on, debating this. However, the influence on these experts by the utility companies is so strong. So this means that, for example, if there are very strict regulations in place, this means a much higher cost for the utilities. And so these experts and the standards that were set in, and this is what I have especially learned from studies which have happened, investigations later, is that the standards were set at a level which would be high enough to say to to assume to keep safety, but still low to try and keep the costs also as low as possible, as cheap as possible.
It's very rare for the leader of a country to change their position in the middle of ruling. That's exactly what happened with you when it came to your position on nuclear power. You were for nuclear power, and then you turned against while you were still a sitting prime minister.
私はこの 3.11 の前は安全性を
Before March 11 and the disaster, I was holding the position that if the safety could be ensured, then we should continue to utilize nuclear power and nuclear power plants. But as you said, this position changed. The Fukushima disaster brought us on the verge of having to evacuate 50 million people, and we were only just one small step away from perhaps facing this kind of situation. So thinking about how to avoid such a risk, such a situation happening again, of course there are many technical suggestions and opinions in place, but if we think also of the risk which is posed by, for example, when we consider what happened with the terrorist attacks of 9/11, it's impossible to totally prevent any kind of accident or disaster happening at the nuclear power plants. And so the one way to prevent this from happening, to get rid of the risk of having to evacuate such huge amounts of people, of 50 million people, and for the benefit of the lives of our people and even the economy of Japan, I came to change to the position that the only way to do this, what was necessary to do this, was to totally get rid of the nuclear power plants.
I wanted to step back. When you were weighing evacuating Tokyo, you had the communities closest to the plant not yet evacuated. The American embassy said Americans should leave. Other other foreign governments told their nationals to leave. But Japan, you, the prime minister, did not tell those people at the closest areas like Futaba. The mayor of Futaba himself evacuated that community. Why?
もともとは避難をする範囲は
So at the time, the measures which are in place in the case of a nuclear disaster is what is first supposed to be done is to set up a local control center where the local governments, local municipalities gather on this off-site center, as we call it, in the case of an earthquake, for example, to decide what to happen, or in the case of the nuclear disaster. However, because of the earthquake, it was not actually possible for these people to actually gather at an early stage, and also because of the high levels of radiation. So this meant that this off-site center was not able to function as it should have in the plan. And so what did happen in order to decide upon the policies for evacuation, how to do this, was those who gathered at the Prime Minister's office, so the NISA and also the TEPCO and experts and so on debated this. In particular, Mr. Watanabe, who was in charge of the Nuclear Safety Committee, was giving advice about this. And upon the advice of Mr. Madarame is how this decision and the policy was put in place for the evacuation. And so upon hearing reports of the fact that the cooling functions at the plant had stopped, the first thing that we did was to evacuate those within the 5-kilometer radius of the plant. And then from here expanding to the 10, 15, 20, and 30 kilometers, giving instructions for people to remain indoors. And this was done straight away on the days of March 11 and March 12.
専門家の皆さんはあまり広い範囲をいっぺんに
And so upon the advice and recommendations of experts as we were thinking how to set these evacuation zones and when and how, one of the considerations was that if the broader evacuation zone had been set right from the beginning, then those who were living closest to the plant because of transportation and congestion may not actually be able to leave the area. And so the decision was made to first evacuate those closest to the plant, so within the 5-kilometer zone. And then from there, we gradually expanded to 10, 15, 20, and so on. At the time, I had been hearing also, and we were aware of the instructions which had been given, for example, by the United States Embassy and the embassies of other countries for their citizens within, for example, 50 miles to evacuate. However, in the case, of course, from the position of the Japanese government, there are so many citizens living within this area. So to move this number of people all at once was something we had to really consider how this could be feasible.
Mr. Khan, can you explain what the nuclear village is?
最強の圧力団体。
This is the strongest pressure group politically, socially, and in terms of even influence on the media, the most powerful of this kind of network, shall we say, and even now having huge influence.
Do you think the nuclear village brought you down?
私自身が退任をすることになった理由
In regards to the reason why I left the position of Prime Minister, I don't believe the influence of the nuclear village was necessarily so strong. More than that, the problems within the party and within the Diet were more the reasons for this. But if we were asked whether they had zero influence, well, considering that I changed the policy and I put forward the path to nuclear phase out to zero nuclear, and because of this, there was various misinformation and criticism which was put forward by the village against this. And so I could not say that there was absolutely no influence at all.
You've said that the meltdown at Fukushima was the most serious accident in the history of mankind. More serious than Chernobyl?
I believe that the nuclear disaster at Fukushima was was definitely the largest, most severe of all nuclear disasters, including going above Chernobyl. The reason for this, as I mentioned before, is the accident itself in Chernobyl was, of course, immense, but it was one reactor in this case. In the case of Fukushima, we have the meltdown, the melt-through of 3 reactors. And not only this, but the high number of spent fuel pools also. And even now, radioactive materials continue to be released in Fukushima. And this is having a very long-lasting effect that will continue from now. So because of this, I believe that the disaster at Fukushima was larger than that of Chernobyl and is still continuing today.
Do you think that the food and water of Japan is now safe?
In regards to the food and water, there is very thorough monitoring taking place. And so that which is actually going for sale or to market is only that which has gone through this monitoring and testing and has been declared to be within the safe standards. And so because of this, I believe that the food which is available on the market is safe. However, when we consider that there is still the issue of contaminated water on the site of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant being unresolved, and the fact that decontamination efforts are continuing, but in many places this remains insufficient. While it can be said that perhaps the food which is actually going onto the market is safe, we cannot say that the situation has returned to as it was.
Is part of the reason for the push for nuclear power, even after Fukushima, do you think it has to do with nuclear weapons, with developing plutonium?
まず今
In regards to considering countries which are considering or wanting to build new nuclear power plants, I believe that there are 2 main reasons for this. One is in the situation particularly of countries which are, for example, at the moment reliant on buying natural gas from Russia, wanting to be not controlled or not having to completely follow Russia for this, but to be energy independent. And so, for example, the country of Estonia, which did actually decide not to build its nuclear power plant, but is perhaps one example of this. And the next major reason, I believe, is also because, of course, if nuclear power plants are built, this also does lead to creation of plutonium. And so this leads to the latent capability to create nuclear weapons. And so having this is also one reason that I believe some countries consider building or having nuclear power. So keeping the future possibility of this, and this is a reason which I think cannot be denied.
Months after the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima, you went to the 66th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima. It was August 6, 2011, that you went for the memorial service. What is the connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear power?
広島、長崎の原発投下の記念日は
Well, first of all, in regards to the anniversary memorials of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I participated in these as almost all prime ministers of Japan do every year. So attendance at this ceremony was not necessarily because or connected to Fukushima, but something which occurs every year. However, of course, there is a fundamental connection between Fukushima and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. The technology of nuclear reactors was actually developed, of course, through the Manhattan Project. And it is through the development for nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, that the technology for nuclear power plants came about. And the same technology is being used within this. So there is this fundamental link between the 2. as well as it's through the creation of plutonium. This connects to, of course, the development of nuclear weapons, which threaten the whole of humanity, and also nuclear power, which puts all of humanity at a huge risk. So I personally believe that it is important to abolish both of these, both nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants. Of course, in the case of Japan, we do not possess nuclear weapons, so we're working now here in Japan to prevent or to get rid of nuclear power plants.
In 2011, Shigeru Ishiba, a former defense minister, said, "I don't think Japan needs to possess nuclear weapons, but it's important to maintain our commercial reactors because it would allow us to produce a nuclear warhead in a short amount of time. It's a tacit nuclear deterrent." Can you comment on this, Mr. Khan?
そういう考え方は特に自民党の中に
This way of thinking is something which has existed since a long time ago, particularly within the Liberal Democratic Party. Actually, nuclear power was first promoted within Japan by the former Prime Minister Nakasone, and the reason for this was very similar to the reason in Mr. Ishiba's statement.
中曽根さんが原発政策を進めたその理由には
I personally believe that for Japan, developing nuclear weapons is not an option for Japan and not something that is necessary at all.
Why do you think the current Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, is so pro-nuclear even after Fukushima?
安倍総理がその従来の自民党
I believe that in the case of Prime Minister Abe, he is not necessarily more pro-nuclear power or stronger for nuclear power than other previous LDP prime ministers. However, the biggest problem, the biggest issue is the fact that he is continuing to push for this even after the experience of Fukushima. So the situation, I don't believe that the current LDP, including Prime Minister Abe, is necessarily more strongly pro-nuclear than they have been in the past. But I just cannot understand why he can make the decision, how he can make the decision that even having the risk of having to evacuate 50 million people, residents, he still wants to promote nuclear power. Why we have to bear such a risk, I just cannot understand this.
彼は原発をなくすと
It said that there could be an even larger earthquake in the Tokai Trench area of central Japan. Could this lead to a disaster like Fukushima or even larger?
可能性はあります。ですからその地震や津波そのものを
I believe that such a risk does exist. It is not possible to prevent natural disasters such as earthquakes and tsunami, but humans can prevent man-made disasters such as nuclear disasters. If a disaster does happen, for example, an earthquake in the Tokai Trench, that is exactly why we need to stop nuclear power plants now. Japan is a country and area very prone to natural disasters, similar to the west coast of the United States, for example, and this is why it's so important to get rid of the nuclear power plants now, because even though we cannot prevent natural disasters, it is possible for us to prevent nuclear disasters.
Can Japan secure its energy future without nuclear power?
十分原発なくてもエネルギー
I believe that indeed it is very much possible for Japan to secure its energy needs without relying on nuclear power. My last job when I was in the position of Prime Minister was to introduce the feed-in tariff, and that system, which has now been in place for 1.5 years, has led to now there are applications in place for, in the case of solar power, up to 20 million kilowatts of energy to be produced through solar. And actually already in operation is 3.5 million kilowatts in just this 1 year. And so considering this equivalent capacity, that is almost the same as, for example, 20 nuclear power plants. So if we consider what could be done in 10 years, 20 years, I believe that it is very much possible to replace the proportion of electricity and energy needs which were covered by nuclear power with renewable energy. And also up to the year 2050, I believe it is very much possible to decrease the reliance on fossil fuels and cover the majority of power needs or energy by renewable energy. Japan can follow the path that, for example, Germany is going on now, and Japan has enough technological capacity to do this.
You're traveling the world and you've come to the United States. What's your international message, and particularly for President Obama, who is pushing for the building of more nuclear power plants? This hasn't happened in close to 40 years because of the anti-nuclear movement and the costs of ensuring nuclear power plants as well as dealing with the nuclear waste. What would you say specifically to President Obama?
まず今のアメリカの状況、私も
In regards to the situation in the United States, I have actually been there several times recently and heard from people involved. And I believe that actually the situation, while there is no creation of new nuclear power plants, because of the aging nature of many of the plants, there is actually moves towards or reduction of the number of nuclear power plants. At the peak, I heard that there was about 150 plants in Japan and in the United States, and the number now I hear is at around 95. But I believe that the big reason for this is the disaster at Fukushima showed the cost of how much it is to maintain the safety of the nuclear power plants, and really showing that economically also, rather than relying on these nuclear power plants, but it's more economically beneficial to look for other options of energy, including also perhaps fossil fuels and shale gas. So I believe that while there are many plans in place for the construction of new nuclear power plants, they are not actually physically going into the construction phase for this. So my message to Obama would be, when considering energy policy from now and considering the issues and the problems of cost and also nuclear waste, while it may have been once said that there was a nuclear renaissance, nuclear technology now is clearly old and dangerous technology, and we need to be looking at other ways. And finally, there is one point which I would like to share also through many different discussions and visiting the United States and so on. But one thing which has left a very deep impression on me through exchange and discussions with the former NRC chair, Gregory Yazgo. And the thing that he said to me was, we don't know when or where a nuclear disaster may happen, but we do know that it may happen. And so we need to think not that this won't happen, but think about what to do if this does, or how to prevent this from happening. And he, when he was in Japan, met with many people from Fukushima, many people who were directly affected and suffering from the disaster. And what he said was that nuclear power plants should not be built in places near where people would have to evacuate if something did happen. And this is the reason, for example, I hear why he was against the extension of the Pilgrim plant near Boston. And I also very much share this opinion with him. Nuclear power plants should not be built in any kind of location where people would have to evacuate if something were to happen. So when we consider that in the case of Japan, there is nowhere where nuclear power plants could be built, should be built. And within the whole world also, I believe there is no, or probably almost no places where a nuclear power plant should be built. So I would like to share this finally.
What message do you have for anti-nuclear grassroots activists for reaching the old you, the Prime Minister of Japan, who was pro-nuclear?
私がロサンゼル、カリフォルニアに行ったり
I personally have visited California, New York, and Boston on the invitation of such grassroots anti-nuclear activists, and speaking with them and hearing about what they're doing, and also visiting Taiwan in a similar capacity. I feel that, of course, it is important to speak or to approach presidents, Congress, parliaments, but more than this, we need to look at the local level, how you can speak with your municipal government, mayors, state governor, for example, and how to approach and work with local political leaders is the most effective. In the case, for example, of the decision to decommission the San Onofre plant in California, I believe that this was crucial for this point also. So it's very important. My message that I would like to share for grassroots activists is to remember to not only look at the national, but also think about how you can actively approach your local politicians to work for this.
Mr. Naoto Kan, arigato gozaimasu. Thank you very much. Naoto Kan, he was Prime Minister of Japan when the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown occurred. He's one of the few sitting world leaders to have changed his position completely while in office. He's now a leading opponent of nuclear power anywhere. I interviewed him in his offices in Tokyo, Japan. Special thanks to Mary Joyce, Makiko Nakano, and Neil Shibata. When we come back, Noam Chomsky.